International consultancy Wood Mackenzie released a new study today about the future of LNG development. And what they did was model a 2-degree increase in global temperatures by the end of the century. What would that do to LNG? And the answer is not very well, is not going to be very welcome in Canada. And we're going to talk to Kateryna Filippenko, the analyst who headed up the report. And she's going to talk to us from Vienna. So welcome to the interview, Kateryna.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Now, this is very interesting because if you had asked me a year ago if governments were around the world were going to be much more aggressive in their climate policy, I would have been a little skeptical. But I think that the COVID-19 pandemic has changed that. I think that really has been a step change in terms of climate policy. And this 2-degree scenario that you've sketched out is more probable now than not. So what were some of the consequences for LNG development and demand that you found in your modeling?
Right. Well, first of all, I'm completely agreeing with you. Even a year ago, the situation was so much different. And this year, in fact, was transformational for the industry, not only because of the pandemic, but because we saw such a big commitment to the energy transition. And we saw that the majors either stuck to the existing commitments or even set more ambitious goals. And then we saw also countries and governments committing to net zero in 2050 or in 2060. So it was really a transformational year. So absolutely, the accelerated energy transition is becoming a reality. So our accelerated energy transition 2-degree scenario looks at what will happen with the world if with the gas market, if we really manage to limit global warming to 2 degrees. And as you correctly pointed out, it is a probably difficult message for LNG developers because in our base case, which is if we do nothing and if we just stay on this 3-degree warming trajectory, the global gas demand continues growing. But in the 2-degree scenario, the global gas demand can peak as early as 2025 and then decline afterwards. With weaker global gas demand, the outlook is obviously difficult for developers of new LNG projects. For example, in the base case, we expect that by 2040, the world will need about 450 billion cubic meters of gas per year coming from new LNG projects. In the accelerated energy transition scenario, this gap shrinks down to about 145 billion cubic meters. And if we assume that Qatar continues with the expansion of North Field East, which we already see happening either in the end of this year or early next year, the space will shrink down to about 100 billion cubic meters. And this is approximately a quarter of what we expected in the base case. So as you see, the space is much smaller. And
Right.
that means the competition will be much tougher.
Exactly, and you point out in the release that low-cost producers like Russia and Qatar are more than likely to fill that demand, the emerging demand, than higher-cost producers in Canada. And in fact, now this is bad news for Alberta Premier Jason Kenney, but it's unlikely, in fact, in this scenario that further Canadian LNG development will go ahead.
It is true that the low-cost producers will have upper hand, and we see in our analysis that in early 2030s, new projects will still be needed. So the market will still call on new developments, but the long-term feasibility of these projects will be a bit questionable because in the longer term, you'll see the situation when global gas market will continue shrinking. At the same time, low-cost producers such as Qatar and Russia will still continue trying to monetize on their vast gas resources. And we assume that they will continue expansion of their LNG production. And that basically means that the longer term feasibility of this big LNG projects which are more expensive than the Russia and Qatar are questionable. So in this scenario, we don't assume that any expansion of Canadian projects happens. We don't assume any expansion of Mozambique projects. And in fact, we assume that even though new US projects will happen in early 2030s, they are at high risk of being underutilized towards the end of the outlook, towards the 2040s.
Now, your study also noted that there's a risk of 12 trillion cubic meters of already discovered gas resources that will be stranded. That has to make LNG developers, as you say, a bit cautious.
Yeah, absolutely. So we see that in our 82 scenario, the two key kind of types of projects that are impacted are, or categories of projects that are impacted are the discovered pre-FID resources and resources that are expected from exploration. So exploration is an interesting story because one would ask, do we even need to continue with exploration? And we assume that yes, some exploration volumes are still needed. So the companies will use exploration as a way, as like a portfolio improvement tool, because sometimes it's even easier to explore for new resources than decarbonize the existing legacy production. But the other category is discovered resources that haven't been sanctioned yet, so that haven't had a final investment decision yet. And indeed, out of these resources, we expect about 12 trillion cubic meters to be stranded. And mainly this will be in the US, in Russia, and the Middle East.
Now, I have one final question for you, Kateryna, and I'm kind of curious. If our perception of LNG has changed over the past year, I'm wondering what the role of wind and solar emerging as being the lowest cost form of energy. And particularly, we see now the combination of batteries with renewables as being very competitive, because there used to be this argument that gas would always be needed to firm up electricity production, and that as coal, we transitioned off coal for power generation, it would be a lot of it would be replaced with gas. And the thinking seems to have changed around that. Is that accurate from your point of view?
Well, coal is indeed being displaced by gas and in fact it plays a very important role in decarbonizing developing countries. Like for example, in Asia, where coal still contributes about 40% to their energy mix, gas will play a crucial role to decarbonize the region, and it will actually provide upside to the gas demand that we have in this 82 scenario. But longer term, renewables are going to play a bigger role in Asia. They're already playing massive role in the US and in Europe, so they will put higher pressure on gas in the longer term. But it's also worth noting that there's also a way for renewables to contribute to, in a way, to support gas, and I'm talking here about various projects on decarbonizing gas production. So for example, there are examples of LNG projects where power production is being connected to the grid, where power is sourced from the renewable sources rather than producing power for this LNG plant at the site itself. So kind of renewables can also contribute to a way how to decarbonize production from certain gas plants. And this could also in turn provide some support to gas demand.
That's actually something I hadn't thought of, and it is an issue in Canada, and that's the carbon intensity of the natural gas that goes into, that's the feedstock for LNG. And in Canada, we have, in some of the provinces, we have a big problem with methane emissions. And is carbon intensity of the natural gas going to play a role in, and especially in carbon pricing markets, is it going to play a role in determining, which natural gas which LNG projects go ahead, I guess is what I'm asking.
It is definitely gaining a bigger importance in the thinking of buyers and the producers thinking as well. And we also see Europe considering carbon border adjustment tax. It's still quite early in the day, but it is something that can potentially shift the cost landscape when it comes to different import sources into Europe, for example. But yes, absolutely, it's going to get more and more attention. And in fact, we are right now looking closely at the carbon emissions from the different gas productions and at different options how gas projects can decarbonize and kind of secure their space in the market.
Kateryna, thank you very much for this. Really appreciate it.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.